I think this guy really likes the Smashing Pumpkins. I don't mind them. Anyways, the Smashing Pumpkins albums, worst to best, you know the drill. And the album at the bottom of my list is Melancholy in the No. I mean, if someone out there has listened to every Smashing Pumpkins album and thinks that Melancholy is their worst, then that's just how they feel, so I can't argue with that. Similarly, my ranking of the Smashing Pumpkins albums is also based on opinion, so chill. The album that's actually at the bottom of my ranking is the one being called Autumn, though if that's named after the Egyptian deity, I don't think that's normally how it's pronounced.
ATUM.
But this is a man with reportedly Irish ancestry who apparently didn't know how to pronounce the Gaelic festival of Samhain.
Samhain.
Anyway, I didn't want to put this album at the bottom of my worst to best ranking, because firstly, it's the Smashing Pumpkins album that I've listened to the least, and secondly, there's some moments on this album that are possibly at least the best music that we've heard from the Pumpkins in the 21st century. But after I listened to the entirety of Autumn, I found out that that statement applied to far less of the music than what you'd hope for from an album that's more than 2 hours long. Also, I thought it would be fun to listen to the whole thing in one sitting for a reaction video. In the end, it turned out to be not all that fun, and also not that good of a video. By the time I got to the third act of this rock opera in 3 acts, I was more or less just waiting for the whole thing to end, really. Maybe he's actually better off making shorter songs now. I had actually listened to Act 1 a couple of times before I listened to it again for that failed video, and I gotta say, even after then, I think Act 1 still exceeds my expectations. I'd heard Act 2 on its own once before I heard the whole thing in one sitting, and I felt like there were moments that were quite good. Unfortunately, those good bits seem to be all in the second half of the act. Going from the relative consistency of Act 1 straight into Act 2 is a bit of a nosedive. And it could have just been my restlessness by the time I got to Act 3, but for most of Act 3, I was just numb. Like I said earlier, there were some moments on this album that felt quite strong musically, but I reckon there were about 5 times where I only started to feel that way during the second half of a given song, after the first half of it was
A bit shaky, you know, a little bit.
So Act 1 absolutely hoodwinked me into thinking that Acts 2 and 3 were going to be at least relatively on the same level. The album does represent some evolution in the overall Pumpkin sound, but if you think that means that William Patrick Corgan has moved past the sound that he created on Sear, an album that I will get to later on of course, you would be mistaken for the most part. The problem isn't that some of these songs sound like leftovers from Sear, it's that they sound like Sear rejects. I genuinely wonder if some of these synth lines would sound more interesting if they were played in that typical overblown 80s synth sound on a song like Jump by Van Halen. At least that would have a bit of life in it. Actually, I guess a song like Spellbind is pretty close to fitting that cheesy 80s style synth description. By the way, Spellbinding might just be the most generic piece of shit song the Pumpkins have ever put out. Whoa. When I listen to it, I feel like I'm gonna get bloody diabetes. But there are some synths on this album that sound a bit more spacey, and some generally decent synth-driven passages as well. So that's somewhat of a good sign going forward. Another genuinely good thing about Autumn is that I think for the first time since Oceania, there are some genuine shredding guitar solos on here. So that's hopefully a good omen for future Pumpkins music as well. The downside of that is that whenever there was a more rock-oriented song in this album, I was basically just waiting for a solo to kick in. Because if you've heard one of the guitar-driven songs on this album, like the single Empires for instance, then you've pretty much heard them all. Except that Empires doesn't have a guitar solo, even though I'm pretty sure they always do one towards the end when they play the song live. Sometimes I wonder if William downplays these songs in the studio so that they can sound much bigger live. But surely making the studio version more attention grabbing is what's going to make most people want to hear the songs live. So like, What are you doing, mate? And don't even get me started on the whole narrative that runs through the entire album. Well, actually, I can't really get started on it at all, because if you have to add a 20-minute audio story to the vinyl edition and do a song-by-song podcast in order to convey the narrative of the album, not to mention that you refer to characters who I'm pretty sure are never explicitly referred to by name in the music itself, then I don't think musical storytelling is really your forte, William. My thoughts on the lyrics of Autumn boil down to... I don't understand what they mean. I can really give a fuck. Please don't show Billy this video. Shit, I just called him Billy. Now he has 2 reasons to kill me. Also, you can't just be like, hey, here's an album that's a similar length to Melancholy, and also Zero appears in some of the lyrics again. So, yeah, it's a sequel. Bro, this album doesn't even feel like a spiritual successor to Melancholy. I think I've said more than enough about Autumn now. It's half decent and half a bit shit, frankly. It definitely has the potential to grow on me the more I listen to it, but that's going to be a pretty decently sized mountain to overcome for me, and it's a question of how often I want to revisit some of the material on this album as well. The next album in my Smashing Pumpkins Worst to Best list is certainly one that hasn't had that much replay value for me. Shiny and Oh So Bright. Was there ever actually supposed to be more than one volume to this, or did William just want to make another arty and obnoxious album title? Discuss. After 18 years, we finally had the artists formerly known as Billy Corgan, James Iha, and Jimmy Chamberlin working together on a Smashing Pumpkins album. Alright, can we get some intense, diverse, and complex songs on this album? Sorry, did you say get the Sugar Ray guy in the music video? No? Jimmy Chamberlin did miraculously get a songwriting credit for the first time on a Smashing Pumpkins album for With Sympathy, but when it comes to his drumming on the album, outside of on Solara and Marchin' On, it sounds like he was basically on autopilot. And we know that James Iha did the backwards guitar solo on Knights of Malta, but if there are any other noticeable guitar parts on the album that James played, then you certainly wouldn't know that he played them just from listening. Not that that's necessarily James's fault, because at the end of the day, these were William Patrick Corgan's songs. So that's probably why Jimmy was on autopilot a lot of the time. In fact, a lot of the songwriting feels like it was done in autopilot as well. I reckon the worst offender in that regard would be Travels, with its verse structure of see dark, see light, see shiny, oh so bright, see London, see France, see Billy's underpants! William's ability to write heavier songs that actually have somewhat of an impact really went to hell in a handbasket on this album, because Marchin' On and Seeking You Shall Destroy just really aren't worth that much time. Solara, on the other hand, at least has a pretty strong chorus and is just a generally decent song at its core, but still, it sounds 10 times better when they perform the song live. A lot of that's probably down to the fact that that's when they get Jimmy to do his massive drum solo, but you also often get James and or Jeff improvising some stuff over the top of it. Again, it's like they're deliberately understating these songs in the studio to make them sound better live. Otherwise, I don't know what the hell's going on. I think the most successful parts of Shiny and Oh So Bright are actually where the Pumpkins tried to do something different from what is expected from them, like the much more soulful melodies of Knights of Malta or Alienation and With Sympathy, which sound a little more dreamy and atmospheric. But overall, Shiny and Oh So Bright has the inverse problem that Autumn has, in that it's just a bit too short for its own good. Now, when I first started planning out my Smashing Pumpkins Worst to Best list, for a while I was certain that this album was going to be on the bottom. I mean, the fucking nerve to bring Jimmy and James back into the fold, giving you 3 kick-ass guitarists and arguably the all-time greatest alternative rock drummer at your disposal. So you decide to start making synth pop. I think that Katie Cole and Sierra Swan contributed more to this album than James and Jeff combined. I mean, look, even Wikipedia is asking for proof that Jimmy, James, and Jeff contributed to this album. But when I was listening to this album again after admittedly a fair amount of time, I honestly felt like maybe a lot of these songs weren't anywhere near as bad as I remember them. I thought that the title track was a pretty underwhelming single, and that the bridge of the song sounds like a bad Broadway musical. I think that second point still stands, but overall, I'm far more at least content with Sia the song now, though I wish that the rest of the album sounded less like that song and more like the other song that was originally released alongside it, that being The Color of Love, because that song is genuinely pretty cool. It's got some awesome driving bass, catchy synth lines, Then the vocals keep it relatively simple and are all the better for it. Elsewhere, it sounds like William was flicking through some archaic dictionary and challenged himself to fit the most old-fashioned words he could find into these songs. Going back to guitars, it feels like there's only 3 songs on this entire 20-song project where they're actually somewhat at the forefront of the song. One of those is The Color of Love. The second one is Anno Satana, which is a bit similar to that one in that it's like a 50-50 mix of synth and guitar and a new wave kind of mixture. And that's another one of the stronger tracks on this. And then there's Witch, the one proper rock song on here. And it kind of sounds like it was the blueprint for what most of the heaviest songs on Autumn are like. So it isn't really all that heavy, but as a song overall, I don't mind it. But when things start to look up on this album, there's often moments that'll bring you crashing back to earth, like going from Witch to the intro of StarCraft. But the first half of this album is by far the strong half. Purple Blood sticks out at track 11 because it kind of sounds like they're trying to be Depeche Mode. But then after that, the songs just kind of blur into one another. I don't know if there's any significant low points in the second half. Maybe Tiger, but there also aren't any real significant highs from what I recall. At its best, Sia goes above pretty much anything on Shiny and Oh So Bright. At its worst, well, it's almost objectively a train wreck, but it's kind of a fascinating train wreck at that. Zeitgeist was actually my first ever Smashing Pumpkins album. Before then, I'd heard some of their better known songs and stuff like the Guitar Hero series and quite liked them. And I think my mum knew that because one Christmas, I think 2012, I got the Zeitgeist CD. It wasn't just the first Smashing Pumpkins album that I heard, it was also pretty much the first ever heavy rock album that I'd heard in general. But even at a time where I didn't really have any other albums that I could compare it to, it always felt like something was a little bit off about Zeitgeist. For an album that was being marketed by the band as their big heavy comeback album, and with William playing the sort of riffs that you hear in traditionally heavy songs, it still felt like the album was missing a bit of oomph somehow. And after several years, I figured out that it's probably down to something that quite a lot of people have criticised about this album. I will say that the mixing definitely could have been a whole lot worse. It's not painful to listen to Zeitgeist, but the instruments feel like they're pretty poorly balanced against each other in the mix. The first thing that most people will bring up in regards to the mixing is the fact that Williams' vocals overpower everything else, as attested by this somewhat popular fan remix of Zeitgeist that brings the overall level of the vocals down. But that still doesn't fix what I'd say are my main issues with the overall mix, which are with the guitars and drums. Obviously, the drums here do have to be very much audible in order to propel the songs and maintain the beat. Also, because it's Jimmy motherfucking Chamberlin. But there's having the drums sit on top of the guitars in the mix, and then there's having the drums pummel the guitars in the mix. I can't be certain whether the issue is that they turn the drums up too loud, or they didn't turn the guitars up loud enough. But when the guitars are at their loudest, it feels to me like they're almost devoid of any sort of texture to the sound. It sounds like they were giving the impression of oomph from the guitars and trying to get them to compete with the rest of the mix by compressing the fuck out of them. But loud doesn't always equal heavy. After all, pretty much everything is super loud nowadays. Oh yeah, Super Trooper, that's some brutal shit. I'll just say a couple more things about the mixing. The bass on the album is practically and justice for all levels. You might have to play the album through headphones at a decent level, but you can at least hear the bass. It just has basically zero influence on how the overall mix comes together. And in what's been an all too common recurring theme in the first 10 minutes or so of this video, if you look back at videos of the Smashing Pumpkins performing Zeitgeist songs live, they do actually rock surprisingly hard. However, I wouldn't go out and say that the only thing standing between Zeitgeist being an amazing album and being an average album is a better mix. There are louder songs on the album like Doomsday Clock, Bleeding the Orchid and United States that are still very much enjoyable, but there's also a bunch of songs that I didn't listen to for several years because I just never really cared for them, particularly in the second half of the album. I think the only songs out of those that I've started to reevaluate after hearing again is Never Lost, but Come On Let's Go and Bring the Light are like the definition of inessential for me. Then there's closing track Pomp and Circumstances, which is apparently going to have string arrangements by Danny Elfman on it. And once they couldn't get Danny on board, I think they should have just binned the song completely. It does sound a bit more like the direction that the band would take during the Tear Garden by Kaleidoscope era, and the guitar solo at the end of the song is alright, but I don't want to have to sit through the rest of the song for it. The songs Stella and Mabel are arguably on the same level as a lot of what the Pumpkins recorded before the breakup, but unfortunately those songs were deluxe bonus tracks. So Zeitgeist definitely could have been something a whole lot more enjoyable, though it's possible that if the issues with the album that I talked about were fixed, then it might not necessarily move up all that much higher in my Smashing Pumpkins album ranking. And next in that ranking, we've got Monuments to an Elegy, which closed out the Tear Garden by Kaleidoscope series, though I kind of feel like William only said it was part of that series in order to try and pad the whole thing out to as close to his original goal of 44 songs as possible. It abandoned any sort of psychedelic and proggy influences that permeated a lot of the earlier stuff in the Tear Garden project, starting to usher in those new wave and synth pop influences, whilst elsewhere going for a more straightforward alternative rock sound. There's only one song that runs longer than 4 minutes, and the whole thing is only just longer than Shiny and Oh So Bright. It seems like Williams' approach on those two albums was to try and appeal to the average music listener's short attention span.
I'd grown very frustrated with that widening gap between rock and roll and, hey, I need to get in that chorus within 10 seconds, mate, or I'm going to start taking the selfie, you know?
That might just be the most boomer thing that he's ever said, and that's even considering the InfoWars segment. That attitude definitely hinders Monuments to an Elegy's ability to stand up to their earlier work. I think a lot of the issues with the albums that I've already talked about can be boiled down to Williams' inability to decide whether he's making music to be popular with fans or to be popular for popularity's sake. Monuments to an Elegy is underwhelming, sure, but it's not horrible by any means. The heavier guitar tones on the album do sound decently heavy, and the songs are generally dependable, even if they don't deviate too much from the original formula along the way. The results vary a little bit when they go beyond the heavy guitars. The piano, acoustic guitar, and extremely electronic sounding drum machine verses of lead single Being Beige doesn't exactly flow seamlessly into its big rock chorus. And then there's Run to Me, which is probably the most divisive song on the album, featuring the title being sung in the song no less than 33 times. 33, like the Smashing Pumpkins song. And I will go on record as saying, I don't actually hate it. Sure, those synths are a bit cheesy, and that can be said about a few other songs on the album as well, but even at their worst, they still hold up far better than the worst keyboard moments on Sear and Autumn. And I genuinely love the moody synth parts on Dorian. So while, like Shiny and Oh So Bright, the shortness of Monuments to an Elegy holds it back, the better ratio between musical successes and musical failures means that I would probably have to put it above Zeitgeist. Probably not by a massive margin though. This is the point of my worst to best, where we get to the upper echelon Pumpkins albums. And yes, I'm including a post-reunion album in that category. After the fairly mixed reception of Zeitgeist, it seems like William stopped listening to quite as much 70s heavy metal and the Nightmare Before Christmas soundtrack, I guess, and instead decided to revisit the old Nuggets compilation. That compilation featured some 60s psych rock classics like Pushin' Too Hard by The Seeds and I Had Too Much to Dream Last Night by The Electric Prunes, with Corgan briefly collaborating with, then later paying tribute to late Seeds frontman Sky Saxon. And a tribute show for Saxon involved both Corgan and Electric Prunes bassist Mark Toulon, who actually played the bass on the first Tear Garden by Kaleidoscope EP before he unfortunately passed away in 2011. Meeting musicians from some cult early American psych bands seemed to give Corgan a serious psychedelic craving for a couple of years. Oceania was the culmination of that musical direction. Upgrading Jeff Schroeder from touring guitarist to official member probably explains the more diverse array of guitar effects that you can hear on the album. I mean, it's hard for me to tell whether a guitar solo on a more recent Pumpkins song is played by Corgan or by Schroeder, because both of them shred like motherfuckers. But if Corgan was playing most of the songs on this album, then I reckon he was still at least inspired by Schroeder to stack up his pedal board a little bit more again. You've still got a fair share of chugging riffs on this album, but I guess they're more tasteful. Beyond the creative guitar work by Corgan and Schroeder, the sadly short-lived rhythm section on this album pull their weight too. Saying that Jimmy Chamberlin is a far better drummer than Mike Byrne doesn't mean that Byrne is a bad drummer by any stretch of the imagination. It's like comparing a man to a god. Mike Byrne's a great, versatile drummer. Nicole Fiorentino is also a damn good bassist, and either Corgan realized that when he was writing the bass lines for Oceania, or just happened to be really inspired when it came to bass during this period. Because to me, this album has the most memorable bass playing on any Smashing Pumpkins album. That's not to say that there weren't any interesting bass lines when Darcy was in the band, but even on Gish and Siamese Dream, when William was playing the bass parts all himself, he never really played anything all that flashy, I feel. Make no mistake, Oceania has a whole tower's worth of talent on it. Oh, by the way, that tower is actually in Illinois. Because of that geographical inaccuracy, I'm actually putting Oceania at the bottom of my worst to best ranking. Fuck you, Billy. Songwriting-wise, Oceania is still far from perfect, and like on some of the more recent Pumpkins albums, there's some slightly peculiar keyboard choices, but all the electronic stuff on the album pretty much manages to gel with the rest of the music completely. There are naturally some songs on the album that I don't like as much as the others, but there absolutely aren't any duds on here. In fact, the 3-song run of The Chimera, Glissandra, and Inkless is up there with the other best runs of songs that have appeared on any Pumpkins album to date. So can you believe it? A Smashing Pumpkins album after they reunited is actually genuinely awesome. Though I don't think it's really a hot take to say that this is the best modern Pumpkins album by far. Now we make it to the pre-breakup albums. And first, or maybe technically last, is one of the installments from the Machina period. Okay, hang on. So, William didn't know how to pronounce
ATUM.
or Samhain, but surely he pronounces this one in the way that most people pronounce the word, right? Oh, for piss sake. Anyway, the album at this position is not the Machines of God, it is the Friends and Enemies of Modern Music, which Corgan probably named as such because he instructed fans to distribute the album for free online instead of releasing it through their record label at the time, Virgin. To this day, Machina II isn't on streaming services, and it looks like the only Machina II related content on the official Smashing Pumpkins YouTube channel is a 20-second clip of drums from White Spider.
It's been 84 years.
The fact that the only feasible way to hear Machina II is to download a vinyl rip of the album from one of the 20 or so vinyls that were given out to fans back in the day may be a lot of the reason why Volume 2 of Machina feels a lot more lo-fi than Volume 1. But also there's songs on this volume that feel very deliberately lo-fi. White Spider is probably the biggest example of that, where the mix is extremely clipped to create a real harsh industrial type of sound. But I have basically zero problems with the unorthodox production on Machina II. Case in point, White Spider is in my all-time top 20 Pumpkin songs, arguably even top 10. To put it simply, I think the Friends and Enemies of Modern Music is basically the Machines of God's edgy sibling. Now, if you haven't given this a listen yet, then you're missing out on some pretty impeccable songs. Going back to 3 track runs on Pumpkins albums, Real Love, James Iha's song Go, and Let Me Give the World to You, the Adore era hit single that never was, is definitely up there too. Album opener Glass, aka Glass's theme, goes pretty hard. In fact, it's probably the closest thing the Pumpkins have ever made to a pure punk rock song, and the gorgeous track Home is surely one of the band's all-time most underrated songs. But the album ends with, firstly, just under 2 minutes of the piano bit from the middle of Glass and the Ghost Children, but played on a weird synth instead. Then the actual closing track, Here's to the Atom Bomb, which I initially thought was alright, until I heard the version of Here's to the Atom Bomb from the Try 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 single. The vocal melody is the same in both versions, but the backing instruments on the album version are just so musically unsatisfying compared to the guitar-driven B-side version. Despite it not exactly ending on a high, if the 14-track album was the only part of the Friends and Enemies of Modern Music, then it'd still have a pretty good shout of being higher up in my worst to best list. But of course, it didn't end there, and there were 3 additional EPs that were part of the package, with some pretty damn fine standalone songs like Slow Dawn, Vanity, and Speed Kills as well. But most of the tracks on the bonus EPs are alternate versions of either Friends and Enemies or Machines of God songs. It includes a decent piano and vocal version of If There Is a God, and a more simplified version of Try 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 that, to me, far excels the Machines of God version. But the alternate versions of Cash Car Star and Glass's theme are nowhere near different enough from the main versions to justify being on here. So the Friends and Enemies of Modern Music does get held back a bit by bloat, albeit not quite on the same level as Autumn or Sear. But there's a shitload of great music on this thing that balances out at least most of its shortcomings. The next 2 albums that are coming up were by far the hardest to decide between which one goes ahead of the other. I used to feel like I had a very clear preference between the 2 albums. However, I feel like I definitely undersold the album that I preferred less out of the 2. Frankly, if I was allowed to have these 2 albums tied for 4th place in my ranking, then that is what I'd do. But for the sake of ranking, I'm going to stick with my original preference. But I might look back on this later and realize that I would be swapping these 2 albums around. I know that was probably a bit rambly, but I'm just wanting to make it very clear that there's no hard feelings in my choice here. So one of the two albums that I'm referring to here is Adore. I'm glad that Adore is still a well-respected album in spite of its lack of commercial viability. Having more acoustic instrumentation in parts definitely doesn't go against the album, because the band definitely proved that they could make great acoustic music before this album. The electronic elements on Adore are somewhat of their time, but this is a case where music that might sound a bit dated doesn't actually sound terrible because of it. And when those electronics combine with the more gothic sounding guitars on songs like Perfect, Apples and Oranges and Pug, nice. I could maybe take or leave a couple of songs like To Sheila and The Tale of Dusty and Pistol Pete. They're not bad songs by any means, just that the album's nearly an hour and a quarter long. But the overall length of Adore isn't really that much of an issue for me. The only song that I really have an issue with is 17, because it's 17 seconds long, and you at least had it as track 17 on the Japanese edition, but not the international one. And Once in a While is a brilliant song as well. God damn it, William! But that's where my criticisms of Adore pretty much end. So I ultimately don't enjoy it quite as much as their more critically acclaimed albums, but I do agree with most people that it's definitely not that far behind them. Also, I definitely rank Shame pretty high in terms of Pumpkin songs in general. And if you can't get past the shame hook, then, I mean, that's your opinion, so fair enough. But also, fuck you. Looking back, I've realised that Adore wasn't truly the album that killed the Pumpkins. It was more so the album that put them on the edge of the cliff. But the album that kicked them off said cliff was Machina, the Machines of God. This album was more or less doomed to fail because Virgin Records didn't let the band put it out in the way that they wanted it to be released, and the Pumpkins were more or less just a general punching bag in the music press by this point anyway, or at the very least Mr. Corgan certainly was.
They were right here in my hand.
Adore was an album that it took me a fair amount of time to fully appreciate, whereas The Machines of God is an album that I more or less appreciated from the very start. Like, I don't want some mopey acoustic guitar piano shit. I want some real driving catchy songs with really weird sounding guitar distortion. But even when looking at this album objectively, I can't really understand how so many people could hear it and think that it's 10,000 times worse than the Pumpkins albums that came before it. Someone pointed out that it's a pretty long album, which I think is something that I'd never truly realised. This thing is an hour and 10 minutes long, but I guess it never really felt that way to me at least. I mean, yes, this album certainly is far from perfect, but I don't really think there is such thing as a truly perfect album. If I give an album a 10 out of 10 score, it's probably more of a 9.9999, because I'm always going to find critiques in anything pretty much, even stuff that I really like. Case in point, there's a couple of individual tracks on The Machines of God that maybe drag a little, namely Heavy Metal Machine and Blue Skies Bring Tears, whereas the song With Every Light, which isn't quite as long, is just a bit wishy-washy, but I still like all of those songs. Corgan proved on earlier songs like 1979 that he could really create this sense of wistfulness in his music, and I personally feel that that comes through on the quieter tracks on this album as well. So I gravitate more towards the songs that are based around shimmering and reverberating guitars and or synths, so the likes of Wound, This Time, and Age of Innocence. There's a fair share of great rock-out moments on here though, like on singles Everlasting Gaze and Stand Inside Your Love, plus Eye of the Morning, which should have been a fully fledged single, and the progressive 10-minute track Glass and the Ghost Children, which they surprisingly performed live when I first saw them 8 years ago. Bit of a strange set list, to be honest. So Machina, the Machines of God, I reckon it's extremely overhated. Despite that, I'm sure that there's a few people out there that consider it to be their favourite Pumpkins album, and I wouldn't begrudge them on that at all, because it's still pretty damn good. Okay, so here's a part of the video where we actually come to Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness. So after I heard Zeitgeist when I was younger, even though the album didn't really knock my socks off, it was at least enough for me to seek out Melancholy, as well as the fact that I did already like Bullet with Butterfly Wings and Tonight Tonight. I ended up ordering the full double album on CD, which seems like a fairly bold thing considering I was only just getting into the band. Thankfully I managed to find some enjoyment in every song on Melancholy, which was pretty impressive as I think I was generally harder to please on a song-by-song basis in my mid-high school years, and B, this is 28 songs totaling just over 2 hours, which is quite a lot of music in any given context. It definitely feels that way when you're listening to Autumn.
What do you say fuck me for?
Sure, not all of the songs on Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness are phenomenal, or even close to phenomenal, but that tends to happen when you're doing a lot of different things on your album. That variety in the music is definitely a good thing, because, as much as I like Bullet with Butterfly Wings, a full album of that, or double album of songs just like that, might get a bit tiresome. That heavy metal buzzsaw guitar tone that the band switched to for this album can maybe at times feel a little bit sterile. It's not on Zeitgeist's level though, that's for sure. This album does still rock pretty hard when it wants to. And when it isn't trying to tear your eardrums, it has songs in this more kind of dream pop vein, songs like Cupid de Lock, Beautiful, and By Starlight, and the album closer Farewell and Goodnight, which features all 4 members of the band singing. How can you not love that? Come on. Then you have Through the Eyes of Ruby, which combines those 2 worlds into an epic prog rock for the grunge world type deal, and that definitely is one of the phenomenal tracks on here. I'm struggling to find other words to say about this album, probably in part because I've been listening to it for so long that I'd kind of take it for granted. It may not be the most emotional or have the most raw, unadulterated power of any Pumpkins album, but it undeniably deserves to be the highly praised and highly influential album that it is. The second best Smashing Pumpkins album for me is the one that my brother bought a vinyl of for me as a Christmas gift. I mean, I don't own any other vinyl records, or a vinyl record player for that matter. So I'm basically just holding on to it for the purpose of
Aesthetic.
Now, Gish is one of the Smashing Pumpkins albums that I previously talked about on this channel in a video that I think is at least 5 years old now. But I'm always hesitant to go back and watch videos that are that old on this channel, just out of, fear of cringe, basically. So there's a chance that I'm going to be repeating what I've already said in that old video when I talk about Gish. Although, back when I made that video, I probably would have had Gish in my top 5 albums of all time. Or top 10 at least. And whilst I haven't thought all that hard in recent years about what my top 10 all-time albums are, Gish's place in the top 10 would be far less guaranteed now. I think a lot of that's probably down to hearing these songs so much over so many years. So it can start off a bit like, holy balls, this is amazing! And then later on be like, yeah, it's good. I think another thing about the songs on Gish is that they don't really have all that much emotional weight, so to speak. They're generally just kind of, showcases for good riffs and playing, even though William insists that it's like a spiritual kind of album or something. Come on, you literally admitted that you wrote the line in the Bridge of Rhinoceros on an acid trip. If the lyrics don't mean anything, then you can admit that they don't mean anything. But in fairness, Gish was inspired by a lot of bands that were renowned for their lyrical prowess, like My Bloody Valentine. But like I've already said, lyrics aren't always that important, especially when you've got guitars going like... I mean, this album is pretty much just cock rock, just with a little bit more Sabbath, a bit more psychedelia, a little hint of dream pop, and most importantly, actual good production. Some of the songs are just alright to me, which is what I'd say for Crush, Suffer, and Tristessa. Also, honestly, I prefer the home demo of Daydream from the deluxe version of Gish over the final album version. Oh, and then there's I'm Going Crazy, which I think is mainly saved by the fact that it's a hidden track. If it was a standalone song, I'd probably get pretty tired of it. But there aren't any true filler tracks on Gish. It's the shortest Pumpkins album from their original era, but it makes pretty good use of that time. And maybe the fact that I've been listening to Gish for so many years is why I'm struggling to think of more complimentary things to say about it. Because I definitely could. They're just not really coming to me right now. Also, I've been trying to put together my words for this damn video for at least 3 bloody months now, so at this point I kind of just want to wrap it up. And you already know what the number 1 is going to be in my ranking. It's bloody Siamese Dream. Still the king, baby.
Let's go kill him.
I feel incredibly privileged to have gotten the opportunity to see Smashing Pumpkins with Corgan, Eha, and Chamberlain closing their live set with goddamn Silver Fuck. I've come across more songs and albums over the years that I'd probably classify as more generally intense than the loudest moments on Siamese Dream. But when Siamese Dream kicks into gear, I could basically run through a wall. In my old video about Gish and Siamese Dream, I probably said that I guess Mayonnaise would have been my favourite song from this album. And it's still an amazing song, as is Soma, as is Geek USA. But yeah, Silverfuck might be my favourite song on the album overall, because it's just an absolute behemoth. And also shout outs to Cherub Rock and Luna. Great opening track, great closing track. And speaking of closing, I think it's about time that I wrap up this video. So what do you think? Do you reckon that there are any Smashing Pumpkins that deserve better? Do you think there's any Smashing Pumpkins that are maybe even overrated? Do you think the band could still make another great album in the future? Or are they doomed to keep making past mistakes? Also, what are some of your favourite Pumpkin songs that didn't appear on any of the albums that I featured in this video? Because there are definitely a couple of non-album Smashing Pumpkins songs that transcend their albums. I just didn't really have the time to talk about them in this video because it's already going to be like 40 minutes long anyway. I don't really know what people are going to be posting in the comments below. Maybe some of you are just going to be telling me that my music taste is shit. And well, more comments means more chance of this video getting recommended to a greater audience. So fucking come at me. See ya.
This is a song about killing your parents and taking drugs. And not necessarily in that order. I'm not scared of you.
We're mean. We're going to burn your eyeballs out after the show. We're going to kidnap you.
See, you don't even know I'm half Belgian. You should be nice to me. I'm a fellow patriot.